Good morning. This is Dr. David A. Paget. This is World Regional Geography 1010, Section 98A, Spring Semester 2021. Today is March the 10th. I'm going to share my screen, jump right into things here. So today, well, two things. The first thing is that you all should be working on the research quiz this week. It's due in 2 days. It was released on Monday. And so you go here, here. Let me go to student. Let me start that over again. Okay, starting in student view, you go here, and then here, and then the research quiz. It's pretty straightforward. It's very similar, somewhat similar to the exam in terms of delivery format. So you have the quiz here. It's a PDF file. Also accompanying the quiz is the answer sheet. Now with this answer sheet, it's a little bit different. You will answer the question. You will provide an explanation for your answer, or it's more of a justification. And so let me be very clear about that. Your justification should be based upon information you find from the reference sources at note 3 only. Okay, so again, do not Google and look up information to answer the questions. You have all the information you need right here at the course, either the textbook, we can call it the Bradshaw textbook, any of the sources listed at the Unit B reading assignment on North America physical environment, or the lecture recordings that are posted, or the history of geography timeline. Any of those sources are fair game. If you run into a problem, if you become confused, if you say, well, Dr. Paget, I've looked everywhere within the sources in the course, I can't find it, just call me, email me. Do not let me see on your quiz, I looked everywhere and I just decided to Google it, because that will get you that. Okay. So please, if you have any issues or questions, that's why I'm here. I try to be very available. The earlier you start on the quiz, the better. If you have any questions about anything, don't try to figure it out. Okay, just ask a question. Don't assume. Well, I think he meant this. No, ask me directly. I'm right here. Don't ask your classmates. Oh, were you there this morning? Did you hear what he said? No, don't do that. They'll lead you down the pathway you don't want to go. I'm right here. Ask me. Okay, if you have any confusion about the quiz, any level of confusion, I will not think that you're dumb. I won't, why are you asking me this? I will gladly answer your question for you. Okay, so you want to try to do the best you can on this quiz. Notice the due date is Friday at noon. And then, of course, there's a penalty for lateness as usual. 3 points every 6 hours is late past the deadline. So again, start early. There's only 10 questions. I probably shouldn't say only, because now some people will wait to the last minute. Don't do that. This is not an easy quiz at all. And there's another one coming next week and another one coming the week after that. So just be prepared. Okay, so let's jump right into the second part of this week's topic, and that is the human geography of North America. And I believe that last time I got as far as the decline of manufacturing in the United States. So just to review a bit, we were focusing upon internal migration within the United States and some of the pull factors and push factors associated with migration in general, or human migration. And so we mentioned last time that during this great migration, or during the great migration that occurred during the 20th century, millions of African Americans left the South for obvious reasons. Some of those reasons we should call push factors. Some of the obvious push factors included just racism, white supremacy, death threats, being unable to vote, lack of economic opportunity. There were lots of push factors that pushed African Americans to migrate from the south to the north into the manufacturing belt and into the megalopolis urban corridor along the east coast of the United States. One of the things that we mentioned was that African Americans were pulled to take advantage of opportunities in various economic sectors. And so in the textbook, if you remember, we went to, here's the textbook here, we start to talk about economic sectors, and we mentioned those economic sectors. And so we talked about the economic sectors. That took us to page 56. And okay, here we go. Economic geography, page 56. Very important. And so on page 56 are the 4 economic sectors. And so we remember talking about sharecropping and how sharecropping was not a economically stable or lucrative means of making a living for African Americans in the South. It's essentially farming that left a lot of Black people in debt. So that was a primary sector activity. African Americans were pulled to the north to take advantage of secondary sector activities, which include manufacturing, and also to a degree tertiary sector activities, which includes services. And so when we go back to this article, we made note of the fact that the second Great Migration that occurred after the Second World War II period was largely based upon the growth of the manufacturing sector in the United States. The rest of the world was in shambles after the Second World War. In fact, in the immediate period after the Second World War in the 1940s and early 1950s, 99% of all the automobiles made in the world were made in the United States, and mostly in one state, Michigan. And so we started to see this growth in manufacturing. Black people started to move to the north to take advantage of these jobs in the steel mills and the auto plants and so on and so forth. We started to see a burgeoning middle class begin to grow in the manufacturing belt from the 1950s into the 1960s. Now, I'm not saying it was a panacea. I'm not saying it was paradise. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was better than being in the racist South at the time. Not that the North was any less racist, but there were more economic opportunities available to African Americans and also more educational opportunities. However, as you can see by this diagram, this is where we left off on Monday, those manufacturing jobs started to go away beginning in the 1970s as China and Singapore and India and other countries began to develop out of the aftermath of the Second World War and started to create a massive manufacturing sector machine, so to speak, that provided lots and lots and lots of cheap labor. So, for instance, these phones that we all have now, I just got one last year. I didn't have a smartphone until last year because somebody else bought it for me. All these phones are made in China. None of these phones are made in the United States. A person in China can manufacture this phone on $2 or $3 a day. I didn't say $2 or $3 per hour. I said $2 or $3 per day. We can't pay people $2 or $3 a day here, especially in manufacturing. And it's not just salary. There's benefits, there's paid vacation, and so on and so forth. American workers are very expensive. And so when companies looked overseas and said, wow, we don't have to pay Frank and Mary in the United States $27 per hour, dental plan, health benefits, pension. We don't have to do that in China. In China, we can give whoever $2, $3 a day, and they'll make a phone just as well as the people here in the United States, right? And we can't just blame industry. A lot of people are saying, well, you're just giving away jobs, you're taking these jobs overseas. No, we like cheap stuff in the United States. We like going to Walmart and getting cheap stuff. These phones cost what, $1,000? Right? You got to put them on a payment plan just so you can have one. If these phones are made in the United States, they cost as much as an automobile costs because the labor costs would be so much greater than they are in China. So we can't blame industry. We can blame ourselves because we don't want to pay, we probably can't even afford to pay the price of goods if they were made here, right? So as a result of that juxtaposition, we started to see substantial manufacturing jobs lost in this country. As you can see, this is from Philadelphia. Started in 1970, about 250,000 manufacturing jobs in Philadelphia. By 2005, down to less than 50,000. And each one of those jobs represents a family that was being supported. And as a result, as an unfortunate result of the loss of jobs, we also saw a loss of quality of life. So the manufacturing belt became the Rust Belt as homes began to be abandoned, people foreclosed, couldn't afford to pay their rent, couldn't afford to pay their mortgage. People lost their jobs, people lost their families, people went into disarray. And as a result, the quality of life in the manufacturing belt and in many places in the North started to go down. We started to see the rise of crime. We started to see all kinds of things start to happen from a negative standpoint in the what used to be the manufacturing belt. And so, interestingly enough, what started to happen, we go back to the African American migration experience, and this is also discussed in your textbook, but the African American migration experience website does a much better job. We started to see, really beginning in the 1990s, we started to see a significant change in terms of, okay, and so we're back. I'm gonna share my screen again. And so in the textbook on page 550, there's several paragraphs committed to the migration of African Americans that we're talking about right now. And we first mentioned the uh, Great Migration when, as we mentioned, large numbers of African Americans moved from the rural and urban South to northern cities, and so on and so forth. And we see some of those cities. We're going to talk about the West Coast migration later on. Um, Again, as I mentioned, in 1900, about 90% of African Americans lived in the South, but that is only about 60% now. Here is what I was beginning to talk about. Is this counter migration or the reversal of the Great Migration started to really occur in the 1990s. This is when we saw through the census for the first time more African Americans moving to the South than were moving to the North. And this was a substantial major shift in human migratory patterns in this country. I mean, for decades, Black people were getting out of the South, out of the South, out of the South, out of the South. But then beginning in the 1990s, we really started to see more Black people go back down South. And the question is, well, what were the pull and push factors associated with this counter migration? Well, one of the obvious push factors was a decline in the quality of life associated with the loss of manufacturing jobs in those northern cities. And so that was one major factor. And when I say the decline in quality of life, one of the major criteria for having a good quality of life as one becomes an adult is the ability to maintain a household. How affordable is housing in a city, right? That's a major factor. Think about that. If you and your family can't afford a place to live in your city, there's not much else you can do, right? There's not much else you can do if you don't have a comfortable place to stay, right? And so having a comfortable place to stay began to be harder and harder in the former manufacturing belt. And then associated with that, as communities went into decay, jobs were lost, businesses were lost, and then came along crime, and murder rates jumped up, and it was just very bad. We look at the murder rates now and we think, oh, murder rates are so bad. Go back and look at what murder rates were like in the 80s and 90s in some of these cities. Much higher, right? So people started to see this life in Detroit or Chicago or Cleveland or Baltimore or Boston or New York or Pittsburgh as being untenable. So what changed in the South? Well, one of the things that changed in the South was the civil rights movement. Now, some people think, the civil rights movement didn't do anything. Everything's still the same. I think Dr. King once said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, you can't legislate morality, right? We can pass all the laws we want. But what's happening in here with people, that's not going to really change. And we see that. We saw that on January the 6th. All right, we saw that in last year's election when 74 million people voted for Trump. After 4 years of racist vitriol and hatred and divisiveness, they still voted for him. So we can't change people's hearts. But what happened in the South with the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts was that Black people in the South got a lot more political power, a lot more economic power, And once the vestiges of Jim Crow and racism left the South, well, in terms of on the surface, it made the South a much more attractive place for business. So we have a city like Atlanta, which was an old Southern racist hotbed of the KKK and everything that goes along with it. Now, all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but Atlanta starting in the 1990s. They had the Olympic Games. Now Atlanta became hot Atlanta. Fortune 500 companies like Home Depot started going to uh, Atlanta. They already had Coca-Cola there, but Atlanta started to become this business mecca for everybody, especially for Black people, as beginning with Mayor Maynard Jackson, who just really established from a political standpoint that African-American businesses would be included in all city contracts. We're talking about billions of dollars, right? And that was just in Atlanta. So the South started to look a lot more attractive to Black people. You know, I mean, just in terms of economic opportunities, the cost of living was less. There were more business opportunities. It was safer, at least it was. And so a lot of African Americans started to move from the north to the south for the first time in this reversal of the Great Migration. And also, there's a very interesting map here. Let's see if I can find it. I was just looking at it. Oh, here it is. So if you take a look at this map, this is a map of the quote unquote new and old manufacturing belts in North America. And so if you notice here in this pink color area symbol is what we know of the traditional historic manufacturing belt: Milwaukee, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, so on and so forth. That's the old manufacturing belt. What we started to see beginning in the 1980s and 90s was a shift. We started to see manufacturing increase in the South, specifically automobile manufacturing. So there was the Saturn plant. I think now it's the Nissan plant here in Nashville. There are auto plants in North and South Carolina. There are auto plants in Mississippi. And so manufacturing started to shift and expand to the South into Texas. We had these high-tech manufacturing corridors in the along the West Coast and in Southern California and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, Chattanooga, Tennessee is called Gig City. I think they have like the fastest internet in the world in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we started to see this growth of opportunities in the South, and Black people came behind them. Greater opportunity to own a home, greater opportunity to send your children to college, greater opportunity to start a business and be successful in the South. All that started to happen. And so we started to see Black people come back to the South. Now, going back to the textbook, if you will, notice this diagram. We've been focusing upon the migration from the South to the North, but there was also a westward migration. And let me see if I can get this. I might have to be creative here if this link doesn't work. Come on now. All right, I'm going to have to do some different things here. Link will be back later. So there was a westward migration of African Americans that was known as the Exodusters migration. So Exodus, of course, is a biblical reference. Some Black people went north. A lot of Black people went towards the west. And there's a very rich history of these exodusters. Um, a lot of towns and cities in the West were founded by African Americans. So here's one. It says Nicodemus, Kansas. So a lot of Black people that migrate to the West um, founded towns and cities. Um, um, there's an organization called the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance. This organization is made up of people who represent cities that were founded by African Americans, a lot of them in the West, in Kansas, California, Louisiana, Texas. There's a rich history of African Americans going west in this exodus, this migration. In fact, some very famous historical figures. Bill Pickett, who is largely credited with inventing a lot of the rodeo activities. I think Bill Pickett was credited with inventing what they call bulldogging in the rodeo. And so that, you know, there's a rich tradition of African Americans in the West. And in fact, I don't know, you all might not remember this, but there was the show, The Lone Ranger, was an old TV show. It was a pretty popular TV show called The Lone Ranger, even though he had a sidekick, a Native American gentleman named Tonto. But The Lone Ranger was a very, very popular show back in the 1950s and 1960s. I used to watch The Lone Ranger growing up. But what I did not know was that the original Lone Ranger, or the show, was based upon a Black man pictured here named Bass Reeves. But of course, in those days, there was no way on earth there was going to be a show starring a Black man riding around the West. So they turned him white. That's, you know, that happens throughout history and entertainment. And what do we call it? Cultural appropriation, right? And so, yeah, but the original Lone Ranger. So there was a rich history of African Americans that came out of this westward migration of Black people, called the, among other things, the Exodusters migration. So now, when we get back into the looking at other migrations, oops, didn't mean to do that. We look at other migrations besides the Exodusters migration. We should make note of the fact that there were other migrations involving other demographic sectors of the United States and in North America itself. I'm trying to get back to this image that we were on for a while, figure 12 point. So here's where we were, figure 12 point. So here's where we were. So we had this, migration to the West, but Also, if we look at the Latinx population, we find that there was another significant internal migration uh, that occurred um, within the United States. So here's a really interesting story. Now, this story is it's kind of dated. It's from 2000, but this phenomenon is still occurring, and that is the internal migration of Hispanic or Latinx populations from various parts of the country, such as the West. And this article doesn't really have a good title. It says Hispanic immigration room boom rattles the South. Immigration suggests that these people are coming from outside of the country, but that's not necessarily the case. So this article refers to a greater migratory pattern of Latinx populations moving largely from the West and from the Southwest into the Southeast. So for decades, um, almost for the entire history of this country, up until very recently, uh, the population of the South was primarily African Americans and white Americans. There was not really a substantial presence of Latinx populations. However, as we started to, as African Americans and white people began to be less attracted to the primary sector, less attracted to working in the fields, less attracted to um, um, heavy, dangerous construction jobs. We were much less attracted to very dangerous jobs in the meat packing industry. One of the most dangerous jobs in the United States is working in a meat plant. We all like to eat chicken. We all like, well, some of us, most of us like to eat beef. But in order to get that steak or that fried chicken to your plate, a lot goes on beforehand, and a lot of people put their lives on the line to do so. A lot of us, again, as African Americans and white Americans, said we don't want to work in those dangerous jobs. So guess what? Along comes the new labor force from other parts of the country, specifically Latinos or Latinx populations, and they took those jobs. And so as a result, we had places like Siler City, North Carolina, that has these poultry processing plants. And it's a small town in North Carolina, 5,500 people, but 40% of the children at their elementary school were Latinx. And so places like North Carolina weren't really ready for this influx. As you can see, from 1990 to 1998, Tennessee's Hispanic population grew by 90%. I can tell you specifically for Nashville. In Nashville in 1990, we were about 1% Latinx. By the year 2000, we were 7% Latinx. By the 2010 census, we were 10% Latinx. So one out of every 10 people in Nashville is a Latinx. One out of every 10. And that occurred over maybe 1990, a 20-year period or so. Now it's the year 2020, and I don't know what the census results are saying now. I have to go back and look, but I'm quite sure that we might be more than 10% Latinx in Nashville. And so you might ask yourself, well, so what? Well, people weren't really used to dealing with issues associated with Latinx populations. Now, on the very extremely bad end, uh, the influx of new people was met with xenophobia. Remember, we mentioned that xenophobia is the fear of people who are different, or fear of foreigners specifically. And so here in this article, you have the Ku Klux Klan rising up and saying that they're angry. The Ku Klux Klan was angry in this case because of the influx of Latinx populations. Even though I'm quite sure that none of these Klansmen and Klanswomen stopped eating chicken. Right? They like to have the Latinos or Latinx come there to work in the chicken plant, uh, but they're not gonna stop eating chicken. And here's a quote from the Klan saying, "To get a few chickens plucked, is it worth losing your heritage?" Really? Now, what happened in Tennessee and in Nashville specifically, where there was a movement to have what we call English only laws. I can probably pull that up. Yeah, here's a Nashville English only referendum. This is back. Yeah, I guess they were, wow. Yeah, 2009. Nashville voters reject English only measure. But just the fact that there was an English only measure uh, says something. Right? And the people who put forth the referendum were trying to say that it was for convenience. So if everybody learns English, then all government services should go smoothly. Just, you're in this country, you need to learn English, right? That's basically what they were saying. But what that was really about was fear, was xenophobia, as we saw more and more Latinos or Latinx people coming to this area in Nashville and in Tennessee. The state of Tennessee also tried to pass one of these English only measures. But it was just an act of fear, and just plain and simple. Fear of foreigners, fear of people who were different, just plain and simple. But largely, we here in the Southeast still are not really prepared in terms of offering materials in the Spanish language. In the schools, we really don't have a strong representation of translators or people who can speak Spanish. And I've volunteered in schools in Nashville, and I've been in classrooms where the kids will show up, don't speak a word of English, but public education is compulsory in this country. Meaning, if you're a parent, unless you have some other good reason, you're a licensed homeschooler or whatever, something else, unless you have a really good reason, your children have to be in school. The schools cannot turn kids away, even if they can't speak the language. The school can't say, oh no, no habla inglés, you got to go. No, they have to take these children in. And a lot of times the schools don't have anybody that speaks Spanish. Right here in Nashville, I've been in these classrooms when I volunteer. Kids show up in the middle of the year. They just sit in the classroom. And the only thing that the teachers can do is hope that there's another student that can speak Spanish and translate, because so even now we're not ready. Not too long ago in Nashville, there was only one police officer who spoke Spanish. One on the entire Nashville police force. So this guy was literally on call 24 hours a day, because if somebody dialed 911 and couldn't only spoke Spanish, they had to call him. He was never off, right? So we were grossly underprepared to deal with this influx, this internal migration of Latinx people. But migration is not only, or internal migration has not only been focused upon the act of migration itself. It also has some focus upon cultures. So let's scroll down. So we went from figure 12.20a, which we've been talking about a lot here, and we're going to go to figure 12.20b. So I'm going to enter a new term into the chat here, and that term is called, that term is called cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion. So cultural diffusion is simply that when people who migrate take their culture with them, right? They take their culture with them. And so this is a map of music as being a representation of culture. And it's really the origin of lots of musical genres that originated with music from Africa. And then, of course, mixed with some folk and missionary music from white settlers, but primarily African music. And so we start in New Orleans. Now, if you ever go to New Orleans and you get off of Bourbon Street, there's a place in New Orleans called Congo Square. And so Congo Square is essentially Congo Square is essentially the birthplace of jazz music and a lot of different genres of music. It was the only place in New Orleans where Black people could actually play drums and other instruments. And so why couldn't Black people play drums? Why were drums made illegal? Well, if you remember, African people used drums as a communication device. So, you know, white people didn't allow Black people to play drums. They didn't know what message are they sending with the drum, except at Congo Square in New Orleans. And so if you go from Congo Square, New Orleans, we start off with various type of music, including Cajun music. Now, I'm going to kind of switch things up a little bit. Now, this is a very interesting history, this meaning the origins of Cajun music. Notice that you have this yellow color area symbol here, and up here in Canada, it says here, this yellow area symbol, it says the progenitor of Cajun music in Quebec, Canada. And you might think that, as we've seen in many maps in this course, that, wait, is that a mistake? Is that another map mistake? You don't think of Canada when you think of Cajun anything, right? However, there has historically been conflict between Anglo and French populations in Canada. And so the French in Canada were called Acadians. And in 1755, as you can read in this article, in this constant conflict between the Francophone and Anglo Canada that exists to this day. Sometimes it's just a rivalry. Sometimes every now and then the Francophone population, the Quebec, the French-speaking portion of Canada says they're going to break away. We don't want to be involved with these Anglos anymore. But back in the 1700s, things really got serious and contentious between the two groups, the French and Anglo-Canadians, and thousands of Canada's French Canadians were expelled. It's called the Acadian expulsion. They were kicked out of the country. And so at the time, of course, if you remember historically, this area of this entire area was held by the French. It was the part of the United States that was acquired during the Louisiana Purchase. But so a lot of the French Canadians who were kicked out of Canada migrated to southern Louisiana. Now, how does that get us to Cajun? Cajun is a mispronunciation of Acadian. So maybe when the original Acadians arrived in Louisiana, if you asked them, well, what are you? They'd say, I'm Acadian. But then after a while, it became I'm Cajun. See, instead of saying, it's just like when people say finna, instead of saying I'm preparing to, right? I'm finna go to the store. Instead of I'm preparing to go to the store. Really, they're saying I'm fixing to go to the store, which isn't exactly correct. But yeah, so Acadian became Cajun. And so you had this French culture mixed with African culture and food and et cetera, Native American. And now you have this thing called Cajun culture and, of course, Cajun music, which, of course, all comes out of this blend. But eventually, of course, well, one of the musical genres that's not here is, of course, gospel. But then out of gospel, you have what's called the rural blues. And so we had the birth of the blues throughout the South. And as African Americans migrated, those rural blues became jazz and eventually rhythm and blues, of course, with the, really represented strongly by the foundation of the Motown label in Detroit, Michigan, by Berry Gordy, and all of the huge music stars that came out of that label, including Smokey Robinson and Temptations and Diana Ross and Supremes, and on and on and on and on. So this map is a representation of cultural diffusion. That is when people migrate, they take their culture with them. Now, notice that you see this green color area similar in Kentucky, and you might think, well, okay, what does that have to do with anything African? But you realize that the seminal instrument of bluegrass music is the banjo. Banjo. Banjo is an African instrument, okay? Actually, all string instruments had their origins in Africa, including the piano. A lot of people don't realize that. You hear violin, cello, you think immediately of Europe. No, those string instruments all originated in Africa. And so even bluegrass, which most people would not consider African music, has its roots in Africa, even bluegrass music. And so here is just another example of a set of what we call cultural diffusion. And so when we get to the start to look at the modern time, or look at, what does this all mean in terms of how can this be applied to anything real, looking at the demography of North America, what is the point? Well, in terms of demographics in the modern sense, a lot of the issues that we saw with racism and segregation has now manifested itself in this wealth gap. And so you can see on this diagram where This is from 2013, but we can pretty much extrapolate this out to today, that the average Black household only has about uh, 1/15th, not 1/10, 1/15th, and in some cases a 20th of the net worth of a white household. So what does that mean? So we're not talking about income. Income is money that people earn. Wealth is what you own. Some of you probably have heard of people being house poor, which means that yes, you might be a home or you're paying for a house, but you can't afford to put any furniture in it. You can't afford to go on a vacation because everything is in that house. And then if something happens to that house, you're pretty much done. In terms of your financial, if the house burns down or if you get flooded out and you don't have adequate insurance, it's very difficult to recover. And in fact, what really is insidious about this whole racial wealth gap is the fact that the number one route to wealth in this country is through inheritance. So people will try to tell you, oh, if you work hard, and certainly we are still a land opportunity. There are a lot of rags to riches stories in this country. A lot of them you probably know about, where people came from nothing and now they're relatively wealthy. I mean, just look at the story of Jay-Z, who grew up in the projects, and now he's one of the 5 or 6 known Black billionaires in the United States. It's Michael Jordan, Jay-Z, Tyler Perry, Oprah, and Robert Johnson. That's it. There's 5 Black billionaires. You can name them in the United States, right? And this guy grew up in the projects in New York with nothing. So there's lots of stories like that. But for the most part, most people in this country who acquire wealth because somebody dies and passes it down to them. But for us as African American people, not having had the opportunity to acquire that wealth, most of us, when our parents, grandparents pass away, unless we're lucky enough and they had some land to save a little bit of money, we might get that $10,000 insurance policy, which most of it goes to the funeral, right? We just don't have that kind of wealth. And so when we start to look at demographics, this is what we study. Like, why do we even look at this? Why do we study all this population? Because when we start to formulate policies and start to make decisions about, how much college financial aid do we need in this country? How much money should we provide to Black colleges? When we start to talk about those kinds of policy issues, that's why it's important that we study population. That's why the study of demographics is important. And so here is another article which has a more recent discussion on the racial wealth gap. And one of the things that you might notice is that here's the recession of 2009. Now, everybody lost. White people lost, Latinos, Latinx lost, Black people lost. Here's the net worth in 2007-8. Average white household was $161,400. Average Black household was about $10,400. Average Latino household was about $10,200. That figure today is only about $1,000 on average. Now, the white population has rebounded a little bit. Right? Everybody took a hit, but they've rebounded, and look at where we are to this day. So this is why we study demographics. There are differences. People want to say, well, race doesn't matter. Well, yes, it does. We can't make things better unless we face our issues straight on. We can't hide from the fact that our history has resulted in these gaps in wealth. Um, we also study demographics because of if we look at different populations with different generations, and um, so let's look at various generations in this country. So you've probably heard of these generations. So here is a breakdown of generations by age. And I think this article is from 2014. So this is about 6 years ago, 6, 7 years ago. So just pushed a lot of these numbers up. So let's see. So this person who was 16 in 2014 is now 23. So that's Generation Z. So if you're 23 years of age and younger, you are in Generation Z. If you're 23 years of age to about 40, then you are a millennial. Then there's Generation X, and then there are the baby boomers, which are people about 55 years of age and older in this age group here. And then, of course, we have the silent generation and the greatest generation. Um, so notice that the millennials are starting to become a greater proportion of the population here. Generation X, not so much. And then the baby boomers, who were the largest portion of our population, are starting to go into decline because of age and of course, people don't live forever, people die off. So why would you or anyone need to know anything about these demographic breaks? Well, there are lots of reasons. We just had this hugely important election recently. Anybody who's involved in political strategy looks at this kind of data because these generations have different values oftentimes. So the baby boomer generation, this is the generation that that came of age, very large generation. The reason it's called the baby boom is because from 1944 to 1964, the fertility rate in this country was at about 4. So that meant that the average woman had 4 children between 1944 and 1964. That number is down to about half of that now. So the boomers were born during that time of prosperity, and they were a big group, and they were very active, and they were very vocal. And you had them, they were marching for women's rights, and they were marching for civil rights, and they were marching for environmental equality. So you had all these movements in the 60s that were carried on the voices of these people who were young during the 1960s, and now they, of course, are older. That generation is going to be very different in terms of what motivates them to vote for different policies than, say, a millennial. Okay, millennials came of age during a time of economic, definitely not prosperity. Okay, the baby boomers still today hold about 70% of the wealth in this country. So that segment of the population there still holds 70% of the wealth. Everybody else, Gen X, Millennials, Generation Z, the rest of you all got that last 30%, and that's just the reality of it. Okay, so we start to look at how we market products for these different generations. We're gonna have to. There's a different outlook on even owning a car. A lot of millennials don't own cars. Uber everywhere, right? How are you going to sell a car to somebody like that? How are you going to get somebody like that to buy a car? Right? A lot of millennials are putting off having children, putting off getting married till much later in life than their parents. how do you market? How do you sell somebody like that on home ownership or being permanently locked into a place? So when we started talking earlier in the course about market demographics and psychographics and geographics, this is the data that people study. You know, because your attitudes are going to be shaped a lot of times by what generational group that you fit in. Right. So here's Generation Z. That's a lot of you all. You all are all about technology. You never knew a time when these didn't exist. Right. So there's a certain relationship you all have with technology that perhaps somebody my age just does not. And certainly somebody my parents' age. You know. So all these things are important in terms of when they're applied in real life. Even with this pandemic, did you know that the death rate for people 65 years of age and older from coronavirus is 80%? 80%. It's almost like a death sentence if you get coronavirus and you're over the age of 65, right? So obviously, but when we look at the other age groups, it's much less. As a matter of fact, for children 14 years of age and younger, the death rate from coronavirus is statistically zero. Okay, and of course, it's a little bit more than zero as we get into the millennials. So there's a different attitude towards coronavirus. If your immune system is good, you're young, hey, you know, you're gonna go to spring break and hang out on the beach and do whatever, you know, no mask, right? Which is okay for you, but your grandmother, you might kill her if you go around her with that, with whatever you brought back from spring break. And that's the reality of this disease. And so, how do we implore upon people who are self-centered anyway, right, about protecting the masses of people from this pandemic? That's a challenge. Still is. It's going to be a challenge. Vaccines are not. This disease is not going away. It's going to be right here. It might not kill as many people, but it's going to be just like a common cold. It's going to be around. So human geography is very interesting. There are a couple of other articles that we should take a look at, and I might wrap this up. Maybe I might go further into this next week because there's a lot more to discuss. So for the rest of the week, one last thing I do want to look at now that I'm in student view. If you want to see where you are, where you stand, I have graded most stuff in here, most of the materials. I still haven't graded the midterm exams. I'm working on them, but pretty much the unit A exam. But these other assignments I've graded. I'm going to grade the article reviews by the end of the week. And so you should know very much where you stand by next Monday. We'll have a good discussion about that. So on that note, I'm going to stop recording.